I'm Joel Miller.
And I'm Jamey Bennett.
And this is Bad Books of the Bible.
It's a podcast about a collection of books with a curious pedigree and an even stranger legacy.
Last week on Bad Books of the Bible, we introduced the Book of Wisdom, sometimes called the Wisdom of Solomon, sometimes called just Wisdom. It actually has a handful of names, but it's one of those books that lives in the so-called Apocrypha, and it lives there and has found a life among mostly Christian thinkers since its writing, or rather post its writing, but after its sort of reception into the church, because of several themes that it displays and uses. And those themes, they're going to start coming up for us now, and we're just going to jump right in to Wisdom, chapters 1 through 2. That's what we're covering today. The title for the episode is Stuck in the Middle, and that will become clear why we called it that in just a moment. But Jamey, let's dig into this book, chapter 1 of the Book of Wisdom, with the three primary characters that we find right at the beginning. I'm going to label them Wisdom, the Unjust, and the Audience. What can you tell us about these three characters?
Well, obviously, we should start with wisdom. I mean, that word is in the name of the book. So that ought to be a tip off to the reader that we're going to be talking about that. But really what this book does is it opens us up with like basically an exhortation to righteousness. But it tells us that the path to that righteousness is being guided by wisdom. So wisdom is what allows us to make sense of all of reality. And that's kind of what this book gets into. I mean, it touches death. It asks the question, did God make death? You know, it deals with, divine punishment. It deals with eschatological revelation. Like, it's big stuff that it deals with. And it does so in such a way that it calls us to something. And like I said, righteousness is the opposite of injustice. So that's the first thing I would say is really it's above all, it's about wisdom.
Then there's the Unjust, which as kind of a set character in the book, you'll see the unjust come up in various ways from the beginning to the end of the book. And then there's the Audience. Who is the Audience again?
Well, the Audience is specifically mentioned as the rulers of the earth, but there's a sense that it could be for everyone. But it's literally like the rulers of the earth. It's literally those who judge, right? So in Scripture, the word judge often is basically the same thing as ruling. Think of the judges. So those who are leaders in this world should particularly pay attention to wisdom.
If we were to drill down on those three audiences, or rather three characters, here's like one cut at maybe some further definition. Wisdom is personified in this book. So wisdom is presented. This is a bit of a stretch, maybe, but I mean, I think it's clear in the way the fathers read the book that it's really a hypostasis of God. It's almost like a person of the Trinity. And I say almost because the Jewish writer who wrote this book didn't think that way, most likely, or at least not as fully as a Christian might. But Christian interpreters certainly see it that way. I want to come back to that in a minute. The Unjust, it's kind of like if you imagine this book is written in, say, 1st century BC in Alexandria, we're looking at kind of the Greco-Roman world is the Unjust would be like who those folks are, and Jews who are adopting that worldview or who are adopting that way of life. Epicurean philosophy or Greco-Roman philosophy would be kind of like bundled into that and might be attractive to that audience. And so the author is kind of like pumping the brakes on that, giving a warning. And then the Audience, to go to pivot off what you said, there's the rulers are kind of like the people who are given the direct, like statement, like this is to you.
Yeah.
But the reader, the average faithful Jew who's reading this book, or the average faithful Christian, like you said, it applies to everyone. It's really
Yeah.
about, in many ways, holding on to wisdom in a world that has rejected that kind of wisdom in favor of another kind of quote unquote wisdom. And
Yeah.
so that's what we mean by stuck in the middle, that the
Sure.
audience is this kind of like, faithful individual who is got wisdom pulling them on the one hand, like this is the way to go. And then the world pulling them on the other, saying this is the way to go, which is kind of what gets at maybe the universal appeal of this book, because you could pick it up at any point in human history and find yourself in some version of that, conundrum.
Yeah.
And I think that's why the book speaks to us today, and certainly why it spoke at the time.
When you talk about these three characters, so to speak, I think it in terms of like, imagine attending a formal debate.
Yeah.
And you put two people on the stage to debate with one another.
Yep.
And the sharpness of the debate is not really for them. It's for the audience.
Yeah.
And so they may go back and forth and make great points, but ultimately it's the audience who's taking it in, who's making a decision, who's weighing the difference between these two perspectives. And that's kind of what we get here.
I think that's 100% right. And that's almost the exact picture to take. There's wisdom on the other hand, there's folly on the other, and they're in a debate about who will give you the better life. And the book is kind of a testament to that back and forth, and then ultimately the vindication of one of those views.
Yeah. If you don't mind, I want to take it back to something you were saying about wisdom being almost a hypostasis, its own personality.
Thank you, because I definitely want to go back to
that. So it's almost like wisdom is not just a divine attribute, but I think what we said last time is, like, in Christian theology, wisdom becomes a person.
Right.
Wisdom is literally embodied in the person of Jesus Christ. But in this text too, though, I mean, there's a sense in chapter 1 where wisdom is identified with the Spirit of God.
Right.
And so wisdom takes on this sense of being part of God's power, part of God's creative, life-giving power extended to us. I mean, I'm reminded in some of the ways that this talks about wisdom, like in the Orthodox prayer that says to the Holy Spirit, everywhere present and filling all things.
Yeah. I mean, that's literally what it says here in this text, that the Spirit of the Lord fills the world. And it fills the world in order to gather knowledge of the world. It's like that idea of comprehending everything, and wisdom is that quality of God that is comprehending everything.
Yeah. Obviously this will get unpacked throughout the book, but and it develops as the book goes along even further. So we'll be able to like riff on this quite a bit during this series. But I also can't help but think, like, with wisdom not just being personified, but like personified at this particular time is almost like when this book was written. It's really preparing the way for the fullness of revelation that we truly see when we say wisdom becomes embodied.
Yep.
Like, it sets the stage for the Logos, for the divine word and the divine wisdom of God to come and dwell among us.
Amen. I would say about that also that this personification of wisdom as God, it's kind of great that it's happening in this bridge period in Second Temple Judaism, because it's telling us that God was busy preparing his own people for this long before Christ. Christ didn't just pop out of nowhere. There was there was a revelation that was kind of like preparing the way for people all along the way. And so when the fathers go back and they read this text, they see Jesus all through it, and they see him there all through it because of these like footprints that God left, this crumb trail of revelation in the Old Testament. Okay, so as we think about these three characters, what what position does God occupy relative to these characters?
Well, he sort of stands apart from it in a sense as an observer and a judge. I
Yeah,
mean, we just spent all this time establishing, his in being intimately bound up with wisdom, but nonetheless, he does seem to play a role as an outside observer and judge in many ways in this text.
yeah. I look at verse 6 of chapter 1. Wisdom is a benevolent spirit, and she will not hold a blasphemer immune from his own utterances. And then now we shift, we pivot to God,
Yeah,
because God is a witness of his thoughts, the real guardian of his mind, who hears his every word. So there's God as
yeah,
the observer,
yeah,
taking in everything.
yeah. He's seeing it all, and it uses both those words, witness and observer, and it says a true observer of his heart and hearer of his tongue. Like, how incredible is that God hears and sees everything?
Yep.
And that's a concept that we often escape, but it is central to our theology. We escape it in our minds and in our actions often.
Yep.
But that's one of the things that wisdom calls us to, is being mindful of even that.
Yeah, totally. Because there's a lot of folly down in there, you know?
Mm-hmm. Right. And we're talking about this concept, if you don't mind for a second, we talk about this concept of righteousness.
Mm-hmm.
Righteousness is a complicated word in a sense, but really in a Jewish and Christian context, it's faithfulness. It's being dutifully observant to God's will. It's pious observance, right? It's not just being a good boy.
Right.
It's much more than that. And in fact, it's sort of like in verse 4, it talks about a deceitful soul. It's like being the opposite of that, right? It's being well disposed to the things of God,
Right.
having a heart prepared for God.
Which makes it synonymous in many ways with wisdom. Like, wisdom is how you act righteously. They're related concepts. And certainly in this book, they're completely intertwined
Yeah.
as concepts. Well, that idea of God as observer and judge, I wanted to key in on one part of verse 9 where it talks about a report of things getting back to God. So
Mm-hmm.
the scheming of the godless man will be scrutinized, and a report of his words will come before the Lord. Um, a report of his words makes me think of in Genesis when there's the angels going down to check out what's happening in Sodom to report back
Sure.
upstairs, so to speak, on goings on down below. There's a song by Tony OK. This may sound a little off, but there's a song by Tony OK where God's up in heaven and there's craziness happening down below, and God says the fools are up doing it again. You know, like chaos. But
Sounds about right.
yeah, but this idea of God being in the observer and the judge, it reminded me that this is a bookish time, and I kind of like. I'm really interested in book history. I like to think about things that are bookish, and there's a lot of bookishness at this time of Second Temple Judaism. Really, after Ezra comes back and sort of reinstitutes the religion of the people there in Israel, you have, or in Judah, you have a proliferation of writing happening, and it starts creeping up in all of the Second Temple literature also. So, like in Malachi, there's a reference to this is in chapter 3, verse 16. This is what those who fear the Lord used to say to one another, but the Lord took note and heard them. A book of remembrance was written in his presence, recording those who fear him and take refuge in his name. So there's this idea of a report being written down and given to God. And you can find that again in the extra bad book of the Bible, Jubilees, which is not even like a part of the Apocrypha as we would
Right.
what we would call the Apocrypha, but it's certainly an apocryphal book. And in the the Jewish annotated Apocrypha. It's actually the very first book in that collection. But chapter 30, verse 20, there's a reference to an inscription of the deeds of the righteous. They will inscribe his righteousness. He has been listed on the heavenly tablets. And so there's this idea of this record being kept and given to the Lord. And you see that right here in the book of wisdom also, that there is this report that's being written and given to God in order to like clue God in as to what's going on. And obviously we know that God is omniscient. So this is a condescension to our ability to understand. But in a world where there are ambassadors and others, officials going out and taking notes on what's happening in the kingdom and reporting back to the king, this is just picking up on that same metaphor, on that same image, and telling us that's what's happening in the world, that God is keeping track of all things, and it's all going on heavenly tablets.
Yeah, right. I if you don't mind, I love some of the language here, because it says that no one who utters unrighteous things will escape notice. Like, it's all going to be seen.
Yep.
It says inquiry will be made. So not just will it be seen, it's also going to be looked into. And then, as you said,
scrutinized, right?
Exactly. And then reported.
Yep.
So in case we missed it, the writer's like, this, and this. Like, there are 3 different ways that you'll be looked at here. 3 different ways in counting, because ultimately, as we said, the Spirit of the Lord has filled the world.
Yeah.
Nothing will escape his notice.
So we've seen these 3 primary characters, and then, of course, God in reference to these 3 characters. We'll just do a quick sum up on them again. Wisdom, the unjust man, you could say, and the audience, the people, kind of in the balance between these 2. And then, of course, God observing the whole thing. But then there's a 4th character. And the 4th character, really, the audience is meant to identify with this character and kind of aspire to be this character. And that character is the just man. Yeah. What can you tell us about the just man?
So the just man is called a child of God in the text. And this is kind of a new concept anyway. I'm not saying that the Old Testament didn't address this before, but this is not a common way to talk about being related to God in the Old Testament. It starts coming up more as we go along. We might see Son of God being referred to in the leaders, but this seems to really apply to everyone.
Like, so for instance, if you are David, you're a son of God.
Exactly.
Now we're saying that's true for all the faithful. Every faithful person is a child of God.
Exactly. If you are following after God, you are a child of God in this text. Now, we can also, I believe that, I'm not a Greek scholar, but I believe the Greek word here for child can also be translated as servant. And so there is a sense in which the servant of God is a concept carried over into Christianity, both for the people who follow after God, but also, once again, it comes back to Christ. Christ is the suffering servant. He's the ultimate representation of the people of God and the righteous man himself.
Yeah, I'm going to jump ahead of my own notes here. And why not? But it's appropriate here. Let's identify this just man. I mean, we've just talked about the fact that this is like potentially all faithful people, as we are aspiring, and there are individuals who are aspiring to follow wisdom, to follow righteousness. But when the fathers read this, there was a particular identification that they made, like who this just man is.
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
Yeah, it's actually kind of funny because I had quite a bit from the fathers I was preparing to pull out for this, but ultimately passed because there was so much. I'll tell you just several fathers I was looking at that just had so much to say about this.
Mm-hmm.
Hippolytus, Cyprian, Lactantius, and Augustine. And everything they said was they're quoting wisdom, 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 and they're interspersing it with Isaiah and the Psalms. And over again, they're taking this and applying it to who else but Jesus Christ.
Yeah. It's like one of the most quoted books, if not the most quoted book of the fathers out of this apocryphal collection, however you want to refer to these books. And the reason is because they see Jesus all through it.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. And they didn't miss it. I mean, there were parts that they would apply to Christ's life, parts they would apply to his passion and death. So they saw this book as saturated with the Messiah, saturated with Jesus Christ himself.
Yeah.
And I had a great time looking through them, but some of these quotes were so long and clunky and they could take a show themselves for us to unpack what the fathers say on even particular verses in here.
Yeah. We can just say that one of the sad things is a lot of the translations that are most readily available on of some of these fathers. Yeah. They're old and clunky, and they might not have even been all that clear when they were first written. But some of them, they just don't scan well.
Yeah. You almost got to work pretty hard to unpack them.
Yeah. Well, I similarly found many of those same kinds of references, and I found it fascinating that that's what the fathers honed in on. And it reminds me of like when you go back and you look at the beginning of the Psalms of the Psalter, there's a reference to the just man, basically, and that's Christ there. So like the fathers, anytime they see this character popping up in scripture and they see him here and there, definitely see him in Isaiah and elsewhere, they're like going, ping, that's Jesus. Ping, that's the Lord. And they're seeing him right here the same way.
Well, and one of the things that happens here, especially in chapter 2, is a mockery of wisdom.
Right.
And it's very easy to see the derision of the scribes and Pharisees, or the mockery of the crowds when Christ is on the cross.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's literally like almost prophesied here.
Yeah, right. And when you think about how the New Testament uses the Old Testament, and then how the fathers following the New Testament writers use the Old Testament, it's used the same way.
Yeah.
The suffering servant of Isaiah could be looked at a number of different ways by biblical scholars, but by Christians, there's some pretty particular ways to read Isaiah. Yeah. And it's no different with Wisdom of Solomon. And chapter 2 right here, especially, I think, sounds in so many ways like it's describing the crucifixion, if not specifically, certainly in like an archetypal way.
Yeah. Well, I want to go ahead and just now talk about the unjust man, since we've talked about, like the derision that the just man is held in, and so on, the criticism that he gets, the persecution that he suffers. What can you tell us about the unjust man here?
Well, the unjust man, of course, is not following after wisdom. The unjust man, as I said, is also even mocking wisdom.
Right.
So it's someone who is almost going out of his way to avoid wisdom.
Yeah.
Think of some of the things that the unjust man wants to, how he speaks of his life and how he wants to approach things. He's got no room for God. He's got no room for the space beyond, ultimately. And he says, like, here's verse 6, "Come, therefore, let us enjoy the good things that exist and make use of the creation to the full, as in youth. Let us take our fill of costly wine and perfumes, and let no flower of spring pass by us." Yeah. I mean, it's flat, literally flowery language.
Right.
About the brevity of life. And it's kind of this, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we may die sort of thing.
There's echoes of Ecclesiastes there.
Right. And I, in a different context, I was reading St. Augustine on this, and he responded to the idea of let us eat and drink for tomorrow we die. And he said, we should reply, let us fast and pray for tomorrow we die.
Wow.
But that's the thing. I think this Epicurean, like, let's live for today
Yeah,
because we don't know if there's tomorrow. It's a temptation that's always before us.
sure. Yeah. I mean, it's ever present today.
Yeah, and many of the, we say in Christian theology that sin leads to death, but we also teach that death leads to more sin.
Hmm.
And so the existence of death is a continual temptation for us to follow this path
Yeah.
of
It's a negative feedback loop. Sorry for talking over the top of you.
no, you're exactly right, and I want you to keep going. So, but I mean, that's exactly right. Like it's one feeds into the other, and I don't know that I ever really understood until very recently this idea that death leads to more sin. I mean, that's something that orthodoxy specifically teaches again and again. And I don't know that I really understood that. But like, this is a great illustration of how that works. The
Yeah.
futility, like, death leads us to think that life is absolutely futile.
Right.
And so we should just fill it with whatever pleasures, whatever things we can do while the flowers are blooming. Let's have a good time.
What's funny about that is you'd be hard pressed to find anyone who claimed to be a Christian who would admit to that. Like if you pushed them and said, like, read these verses. Do you agree with these verses? I mean, they would be like, no, never. But we do live like that. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, and even some of these verses, I think, we all, I think, in a sense, want to seize the day.
Mm-hmm.
We don't want to we don't want to feel like we've lost out on an opportunity. So I think if you took some of these verses out of context and threw them on a Bible calendar, some people would be real tempted to be like, yeah, that's great, and I can't believe that's in the Bible.
Right.
But really, there's an edge to some of this stuff that seems right at first, but you think about it, and it ultimately is leading us away from that life, which is calling us to wisdom.
That's why it's worth reminding ourselves, the listener, anyone else who will bother to listen, that this is a book of philosophy at some level, that
Yeah.
this is a Jewish writer who has absorbed a lot of Greco-Roman philosophy. He knows it front and back and is using his own tradition to respond to that philosophy. And so, like philosophy, the love of wisdom, this is like true philosophy fighting false philosophy, or at least a fruitless philosophy.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think a lot of it too comes down to, and this might take us back towards the just man, but a lot of it comes down to, like, what are we going to be filled with?
Mm-hmm.
Like, Orthodox teaching is not just about doctrine that goes in your head. It's also about a way of life. And so, like, people outside of our tradition see us fasting, and think it's just a bunch of legalistic rules. But from within the tradition, at least as I've experienced it, fasting is more about, emptying ourselves and leaving room for God.
Yeah.
Like, and wisdom in this book seems to say that we need that room for God. And if we fill our minds, I mean, just to put a point on it, like, if we fill our minds with unholy things, or we fill it with pornographic images, like, have we left room for us to grow in wisdom and for us to meditate on the things of God? I have a quote here from St. Gregory of Nyssa. He says, the soul immersed in God does not delight in things that deceptively seem good. If it succumbs to the defilement of passion, it violates its covenant of spiritual marriage. For the good spouse cannot live with a soul that is easily angered, malicious, or gives shelter to similar defects. So I don't know. The soul immersed in God does not delight in things that deceptively seem good. And
Well,
that seems like something we can cultivate.
yeah. I mean, to go back to the warning in chapter 1, verse 4, wisdom does not enter a fraudulent mind, a deceptive mind, and that would include a self-deceived mind.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's a humbling and possibly frightening thought.
Yeah.
So if we think about this just man and we think about the unjust man, we got a natural conflict happening here brewing here. You already alluded to it with the crucifixion kind of being foreshadowed, but I thought I would just look at the way the unjust respond to the just. And you can see this in chapter 2, verse 12, where it says, "Let us entrap the just man, for his presence is inconvenient to us, and he
Right.
opposes our action." I'm going to jump ahead a verse. "He is a living refutation of our designs."
Mm,
This is like just the witness, just the presence of this person on the planet is offensive to the unjust, because what he stands for, what he hopes for, what he lives for is in opposition, not even directly, not even like antagonistically, just by being there, doing what he's doing, he's an offense. And
yeah.
one of the things that's great about this, and by the way, this is one of the connections back to the fathers again and why they read it the way they read it. That verse, chapter 2, verse 12, "Let us entrap the just man, for his presence is inconvenient to us." That is a direct quote from Isaiah chapter 3, verse 10,
Okay.
from the Septuagint, not the Masoretic. If you look at the Septuagint of Isaiah chapter 3, verse 10, it says this: "Let us bind the just, for he is a nuisance to us." Whereas if you look in the Masoretic, it actually flips, and it's a reference to the righteous. It says, "Tell the righteous that it shall be well with them, for they shall eat the fruit of their deeds." Okay, that's fine. That's true. But that's
Yeah.
not what the Greek Septuagint is doing. And what the Greek Septuagint is doing there was picked up by the writer of the Book of Wisdom. And then, of course, that's what the fathers were reading. So when they go back and they read that, they again see this as a prophecy of the crucifixion, because this is the unrighteous, the unjust, laying a trap for the just and then persecuting him. And that is exactly what the fathers read here. So, for instance, in the City of God, Augustine says this: "In one of these books that is called the Wisdom of Solomon, Christ's passion is most clearly prophesied. For surely it is his wicked slayers who are recorded as saying, 'Let us set an ambush for the righteous man.'" This is like he is picking up this verse right out of the Septuagint. He's
Yeah.
picking it up right out of the Wisdom of Solomon, and he's just linking those two, and he's saying this is a prophecy about Christ.
That's amazing.
Wisdom, the unjust, the audience, God the observer, the just man. Drop all of these in a big arena, and there's a fight. And at the end of that fight is going to be a humbling reminder that there are real consequences to the
Yeah.
choices that we make, to the decisions that we make, to the life we choose to follow. And the most humbling reminder of that there could be, is death. And
Yeah.
death is brought up at this point in the book, and it's a fascinating reflection on it. What does the Wisdom of Solomon tell us about death?
Yeah, it's interesting because we alluded to death a couple of times already in the episode, but I think that's spoiler alert. We knew where it was going, um, and the author of this book seems to think that it's a mistake of the ungodly to ignore the end of life.
Yeah.
That to think that nothing lies beyond death is a mistake. But before we even get there, we have to ask, where does death come from? And I love how the English Standard Version translates this in verse 24. It says, "Through the devil's envy, death entered the world,
Yeah.
and those who belong to his party experience it." So, like, it's almost like this sense of, later there's a term in chapter 4, dishonored corpses,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, there's this danger in not only just dying because we share in the wounds of humanity, but beyond that, that physical death is not the only thing at play here. That death entered the world through the devil's envy, but that it's like almost a reduction to nothing.
Yeah. And
And
it's
and with God, right? It's the contrast. So go ahead.
Well, it specifically says that God made man for immortality. So,
Right.
this
Right.
idea that you have you have these competing forces in the world, not like Manichaean, but these competing forces in the world, and man is kind of in between. Clearly, the bent of that at the outset was that man was positioned in the best possible way he could.
Yeah.
He had union with God, and that meant that he was immortal. And
Mm-hmm.
the text says that very thing. God created man for immortality and made an image of his own proper being. Like, man is an image of God. That's clearly stated right here. That's literally the
Yeah.
language that's used. And then through the devil's envy, death entered the world. And I think they're, like ancient Christians and ancient Jewish audiences recognize the linkage there. There's in a very apocryphal book, in other words, a pseudepigraphal book, a book that we would not even put in this collection exactly. There's a book called The Life of Adam and Eve. And this is depicted, actually, this scene where God makes man in his image, and Michael tells the rest of the heavenly host to bow before the image of God. Of course, they should bow before the image of God because it's the image of God, right? Well, Lucifer refuses to bow because this is just a humble creature of clay, and
Mm.
he is a majestic creature of spirit, and he refuses to bow. And that's, a riffing on this idea that this envy of the devil for the person of man, for the image of God in man, and what God had done to elevate man is what made him an enemy of man. And, that is kind of alluded to here, or it's certainly the same basic, thought package.
Right.
It's in the same kit. And so the writer here is pointing out a real important divide, which is that the unjust are in league, whether knowingly or unknowingly, with the enemy of mankind.
Oh, and that's heavy. I mean, in this idea of the enemy of mankind, the accuser, that this is often picked up by Christians, that the devil was essentially a murderer from the beginning.
Right.
So all this ties up together. But one of the things that's interesting to me is that in traditional Christian theology, like, there's this sense in which sin and death, and you could even say darkness, these things do not have an ontology or essence of their own.
No, they're like a privation. They're a subtraction from the rest.
Exactly. So darkness is not the presence of something, it's the absence of light. Yeah. And so in the same way, like, death is not its own thing, it's the absence of life, or the going out of life. And St. Isaac the Syrian says sin, Gehenna, and death do not exist at all with God, for they are effects, not substances. And he goes on to say, there was a time when sin did not exist, and there will be a time when it will not exist. Gehenna is the fruit of sin. At some point in time, it had a beginning, but its end is not known. But here's the idea, is that these things are almost parasitic. And I love his phrasing that they are effects, not substances. And so when we apply that to this text, we can see that quite clearly, that death is the effect of this kind of unjust thinking, this unjust life.
Yeah.
It's the end result. Let's stop it there this week. I think we've covered enough. In the meantime, if you enjoyed this episode, please visit badbooksofthebible.com to see all the things we're up to, and consider sharing this episode with a friend. I'm Jamey Bennett.
And I'm Joel Miller.
And you've been listening to Bad Books of the Bible,
a production of Ancient Faith Radio. Come back next week where we get some good news and some bad news.